30 feet below a Manhattan sidewalk in 1991, construction workers digging the foundation for a new federal office building pulled a human skull from the earth. Then another, then another, then the outline of a coffin, then rows of coffins, stacked in layers, stretching in every direction beneath the construction site. Within weeks, archaeologists had uncovered 419 intact burials. The bodies were not colonial settlers. They were not soldiers. They were not plague victims. They were enslaved Africans, buried in the only ground the city would allow them, outside the walls of the settlement that their labor had built. The site was a 6.5-acre cemetery that had been in use from the 1690s to 1794. Historians estimate that more than 15,000 people were buried there. It was the largest and oldest colonial-era burial ground for people of African descent ever found in North America. And for nearly 2 centuries, it had been completely forgotten, paved over, built on, and erased from every map of modern New York. The discovery did not happen because someone was looking for it. It happened because the federal government wanted to build a 34-story office building at 290 Broadway, between Reed and Duane Streets in Lower Manhattan. The General Services Administration, the agency responsible for federal construction, had commissioned an archaeological survey of the site before breaking ground, as required by law. The survey team found a 1755 map that showed an area labeled Negros Burial Ground, 2 blocks north of City Hall. But everyone assumed that 2 centuries of urban development, basements, sewers, water mains, and subway tunnels had destroyed whatever remained. They were wrong. 25 feet below the surface, beneath layers of concrete, brick, pipe, and compacted fill, the burials were intact. New York does not have the reputation of a slave city. That reputation belongs to the South, to Charleston and Savannah and the plantation economy of the Cotton States. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, New York was one of the largest slave ports in the British colonies. At various points during the colonial period, enslaved Africans constituted between 14 and 21% of the city's population. In 1703, the only year for which a detailed colonial census survives, 40% of New York households included enslaved people. The wall that gave Wall Street its name was built, in part, by enslaved Africans. The roads, the wharves, the churches, and the foundations of what would become the financial capital of the world were laid by people who were not free. The Dutch West India Company, which administered the colony, both owned enslaved Africans directly and allowed private citizens to purchase them. Enslaved people cleared the forests, paved the streets, dug the canals, loaded the ships, and built the houses that the colony's free inhabitants lived in. Twice the enslaved population of New York rose in armed rebellion. In 1712, a group of roughly 24 enslaved Africans set fire to a building on Maiden Lane and attacked the white colonists who came to put out the flames, killing 9. The reprisals were savage. 13 of the rebels were publicly burned at the stake. Others were hanged, broken on the wheel, or starved to death in chains. In 1741, a series of fires swept through the city, and a conspiracy was alleged, whether real or fabricated remains, debated by historians, implicating dozens of enslaved Africans and several white accomplices. 17 black men were hanged. 13 were burned alive. 2 white men and 2 white women were hanged as co-conspirators. After each rebellion, the census showed a sharp drop in the male enslaved population and a corresponding rise in the number of women and children, suggesting that men who had participated in or been suspected of involvement were executed or sold south. The burial ground absorbed the dead from all of these events: the executed, the overworked, the malnourished, the infants who did not survive their first year, all of them buried outside the walls of the city they had built. When they died, they were not welcome in the city's churchyards. In 1697, Trinity Church, the most prominent church in the colony, banned the burial of black people in its graveyard. The enslaved and free African community was forced to establish their own cemetery outside the northern boundary of the settlement, in a shallow valley near the edge of a pond called the Collect. The ground was marshy, low, and undesirable, which is why nobody else wanted it. For nearly a century, every African who died in New York, enslaved or free, was carried to this plot and buried there. The cemetery operated without any official oversight. There were no records of who was buried there, no gravestones, no markers. The dead were carried out at night, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, and placed in the earth by members of their community. In 1788, the revelation that physicians and medical students from nearby hospitals were illegally digging up bodies from the burial ground, and to use as dissection cadavers triggered the doctors' riot, a violent uprising in which New Yorkers attacked the homes and offices of physicians accused of grave robbing. The riot led to the passage of one of America's first laws regulating the use of human cadavers in medical education. In 1794, the burial ground was officially closed. The city filled the area with soil and rock, sealed the graves beneath layers of urban fill, and began building on top of them. Within a generation, the cemetery had vanished from public memory. Within 2 generations, it had vanished from the maps. The burials told stories that no written record had preserved. The skeletons showed evidence of extreme physical labor, malnutrition, lead poisoning, and infectious disease. Nearly half of the 419 recovered individuals were children under 12. More than half of those children had not reached their 2nd birthday. The bones of adults showed stress fractures, arthritis, and spinal deformities consistent with carrying heavy loads from a young age. One woman's skeleton showed such severe muscle attachment scarring that researchers concluded she had performed physically punishing labor from childhood until death. But the burials also showed something else: care. The bodies were laid in an east-west orientation, heads pointing west and feet pointing east, following West African spiritual traditions. Some individuals had teeth filed into hourglass shapes, a practice common among specific ethnic groups in West and Central Africa, indicating they had been born on the African continent and brought to New York through the Middle Passage. Nigerian waist beads were found on some of the women. Wooden coffins were marked with Sankofa symbols, a concept from the Akan people of Ghana, meaning go back and get it, an instruction to learn from the past. One coffin lid was decorated with a heart-shaped design made from iron tacks hammered in by hand. These were people who had been stripped of their freedom, their language, their names, and their homeland, but they had not been stripped of their rituals. In the only institution they were allowed to build, a cemetery, they preserved what they could of who they were. The discovery was nearly destroyed before the site could be studied. When the General Services Administration realized the scope of the burial ground, it did not stop construction. It accelerated excavation, removing burials as quickly as possible to clear the site for the office building. Within a year, 390 burials had been pulled from the ground, and the agency planned to remove 200 more. The work was rushed. A backhoe accidentally crushed 20 intact burials. The African American community in New York was outraged. Protests erupted at the site. Community leaders, activists, and scholars demanded that construction stop and that the burials be treated with respect. Congressman Augustus Savage threatened to cut federal funding unless the government changed its approach. Mayor David Dinkins formed a committee to advise on next steps. In 1992, President George H.W. Bush signed a law prohibiting construction of part of the planned building and allocating $3 million for a memorial. The excavation was halted at 419 burials. The remains were transferred to Howard University's Department of Anthropology, where a team led by biological anthropologist Michael Blakey spent nearly a decade studying the bones, teeth, and artifacts. The research that followed was the most comprehensive study of enslaved Africans in colonial America ever conducted. Blakey's team developed new methods for analyzing ancient DNA and bone chemistry that had never been applied at this scale. They traced the geographic origins of the buried individuals to specific regions of West and Central Africa, including areas that are now Nigeria, Ghana, Congo, and Madagascar. They documented the diseases, injuries, and nutritional deficiencies that defined the lived experience of enslaved people in New York. They confirmed that the mortality rate among enslaved Africans in New York was so high that the population could not sustain itself through natural increase, meaning the slave trade had to continuously import new people to replace those who died. Church records from the same period told a parallel story. European colonists in New York were roughly 8 times more likely to live past 55 than Africans in the same city. The two populations lived side by side, walked the same streets, and built the same buildings. One group lived to old age. The other was worked to death and buried outside the city walls. On October 4, 2003, 12 years after the discovery, the 419 remains were returned to their original resting place. Howard University researchers placed them in hand-carved mahogany coffins from Ghana. The reinterment ceremony lasted 6 days, beginning at Howard University and traveling through Philadelphia, Newark, Wilmington, and Baltimore, cities along the route that enslaved Africans had once been transported. In each city, communities gathered to honor the dead. The journey ended when the remains arrived by boat at a Manhattan port, echoing the way many enslaved Africans first came to New York centuries earlier. Thousands attended the ceremony. Religious leaders from Christian, Muslim, and West African spiritual traditions blessed the remains before they were returned to the earth. In 2006, President George W. Bush designated the African burial ground a national monument. The memorial, designed by architect Rodney Leon, was completed in 2007. It features a 24-foot-tall ancestral chamber made from green granite quarried in Africa, its height representing the depth at which the graves were found. A heart-shaped Sankofa symbol is engraved on its surface. The Circle of the Diaspora, built from stone from both Africa and North America, features a map of the Atlantic Ocean in reference to the Middle Passage. The burial ground is not the only thing hidden beneath Manhattan. In 1916, subway construction workers building a tunnel near Greenwich Street found the charred remains of a wooden ship 20 feet underground. The keelson, 3 rib frames, and a collection of artifacts, including a Dutch broad-headed axe, trade beads, clay pipes, a length of chain, a small cannon, and shards of blue and white pottery, were pulled from the earth. Experts identified the wreckage as the Tiger, a Dutch trading vessel that burned and sank in 1613, 4 years after Henry Hudson first sailed into the harbor. The Tiger's captain, Adrian Block, was stranded in Manhattan after the fire and spent the winter building a new ship, becoming one of the first Europeans to overwinter on the island. The sunken hull of his burned ship was later buried under landfill as Manhattan expanded its shoreline into the river. In 2025, researchers at the Museum of the City of New York launched a new investigation into the timbers, using tree ring analysis and wood identification to determine the ship's origin. In 2010, the World Trade Center ship was found 22 feet below ground zero, a Hudson River sloop built from the same trees as Independence Hall. In 2013, archaeologists excavating beneath Washington Square Park discovered 2 burial vaults containing dozens of remarkably well-preserved coffins and scattered human bones beneath the sidewalk. A remote camera was used to investigate the remains without disturbing them. In the Bronx, construction of a waterfront walking path uncovered over 100 Native American artifacts dating back to 200 AD. At the South Street Seaport, digs through colonial-era landfill revealed ceramics, shoes, food remains, animal bones, and the structural remnants of wooden wharves that once lined the East River waterfront. New York has been inhabited for at least 9,000 years. The Lenape people lived on the island for millennia before European contact, fishing in the rivers, hunting in the forests, and leaving stone tools, pottery fragments, and shell middens in the soil that would eventually be buried beneath the city. When the Dutch arrived in 1624, they began building on top of the Lenape world. When the English took over in 1664, they built on top of the Dutch. When the Americans won independence, they built on top of the English. And every generation since has added another layer, pushing the previous ones deeper into the ground. The city has never stopped building, and every time it digs, it finds something. The African burial ground sits at the corner of Duane and Elk Streets, in the shadow of the federal office building that was eventually constructed beside it. The memorial is open to the public. The visitor center is free. Most New Yorkers have never been there. Most have never heard of it. The 15,000 people buried beneath Lower Manhattan, the people who built the city's walls and roads and wharves and churches, who were barred from the churchyards of the institutions they constructed, who were buried outside the settlement they were not allowed to fully enter, are still there. Most of them have never been excavated. Most of them never will be. The city stands on top of them. It always has. Thanks for watching. If this is the kind of exploration you want to follow, subscribe. There is more to come.